Great. Hi, this is June Holly, and I'm here with Tracy Kunckler. And today we're going to talk about some of the innovations that are happening in governance and decision-making in networks. At least it's particularly useful for networks. And so we're just going to have a conversation and talk about what we've been learning over the last year or so about some new ways of decision making. So, Tracy, do you want to talk a little bit about why you're interested in this topic and some of your, just start us off with some of your initial thinking in this area?
Yeah, well, I guess it's been 5 years now since I had kind of an awakening of sorts to my purpose right now in this time, which we could call really a time of great transition. And it's a time where we're really having to rethink and relearn how we do everything, because our world is changing very rapidly and we're kind of on the brink of extinction, some people would say. And so for me, I recognize my place right now in terms of being helpful and constructive is around how we govern, because our governance systems are not really serving us anymore. Lots of ways that governance in government and even governance in our organizations aren't giving us the tools that we need to be able to adapt very quickly, to make really good decisions. I feel like, especially in our government, it doesn't really seem like too many people at all are very satisfied with the decision making. That's nobody's really winning. We're all kind of losing there. So are there ways that we could be making decisions that could really be satisfying us and really taking us in a much more constructive and positive direction right now in our culture? And so that's where my passion for this comes from. And as you and I have connected around, we see that networks are really emerging as a form right now that's going to maybe carry us into this, whatever we're evolving into, that we are needing to bring the diversity of voices together like never before. We have a diversity, I should say, of voices. And if we're going to make good decisions, we're going to have a lot more voices at the table and a lot more non-traditional kind of voices at the table, people who haven't. And if there is a table, I'm conscious now, June, all the time of you saying, well, maybe there's not even a table, because that's too limiting in this new phase that we're moving into. So that's kind of an anachronism that I keep saying and trying to catch myself around. So I work as, my work centers around working with groups. Particularly, I'm orienting more and more with groups that are working on large-scale systems change. And it's multi-organizational. It's people realizing that one organization is not going to scale up and be able to solve systemic issues, but that we're very interdependent. And there are a lot of different players, and there's a lot of different dynamics that are going on that are creating the conditions right now in our world. And some of those conditions are not at all what we want. And if we're going to address these large-scale systemic issues, that we're bringing together all the different parts of this system, right? And let's face it, these different parts of the system have sometimes dramatically, wildly different worldviews, And so there's this complexity when you start to try to talk to people who don't share your worldview, or don't see things the way you do, that you it's not even just that you have different ideas about the solution. It's like you have different ways of even framing what the problem is. And science isn't even, everybody has their own science these days, their own science. So there's not even there's no kind of objectivity, right, that we can point to and say, well, this is objective reality. So you're in this kind of very complex stew a lot of times when you're working on some of our biggest problems, a very complex stew. And yeah, so then how do you make decisions in that context? And I work as a facilitator in those kinds of contexts. And so that's where I've gotten some hard-won experience in the last few years about what are some tools, what are some things that people want to think about as they start trying to work with other people.
Yeah, so what
on
are
large
those
scale
things
issues.
that people need to think about if
Hmm.
they have a network and they want decision making to work? What do they need to think about?
Mm. Yeah, well, so let's do this, because I kind of want to start. You've been talking a lot about Frederick Laloux's book, Reinventing Organizations. And let's start with that, because you've been talking about this, he calls it an advice getting. And let's talk about that process, because I think there's a lot of interesting things and lessons and
Mm-hmm.
value to be pulled out from that process. I don't know if you want to take off on that a little bit, June, and talk about advice
Okay, well,
getting,
I'll talk a
the way
little
you
bit
see it.
about, I mean, I guess I would go back and say that the first thing when we're thinking about governance and decision making is to think about the values, because I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's where it's really different. That we have, there's new values emerging about, especially about the idea around the ideas of power, that we need to deconstruct the old systems of power over and privilege, and create in networks very peer relationships. But you
Yeah.
can't just by saying that something's going to be a peer relationship make it that way. So the value of how does this a governance process really dismantle old power relationships and help put in place situations where we really can interact as peers. The idea
And say something about the value of why do we need to interact this? Why is that valuable to be interacting as peers in this time? I find like that's something that people are a little nervous about.
Well, I
You know,
think it's because every person is a precious resource, and
mm-hmm.
they're full. What they are we can only all benefit from that if people are respected and are peer.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing that their perspective is as important as everyone else's, and that.
Totally. And I think there's something about power. If I can just jump in, I know I'm kind of jumping. I might
Yeah,
jump.
no,
We could
that's
jump back
great.
and forth. Totally. We
We're
like to talk this
totally
way.
into that.
I think you're right. You're hitting it right on, like the way we think about power is kind of, and governance, how you make decisions, how you allocate resources, is essentially about power, right? So this is what we are playing, and investigating. But power and control, that's something that because people talk about sharing power, and I sometimes I am I feel not great about sharing power, because it makes it seem like power is this limited thing, right? It's a pie and we divide it up. But I think of power, when the kind of power that you're talking about, when everybody is in a peer relationship and they're free to express their gift and and move through the world as a sovereign being, making their own choices and decisions. That kind of power is a lot like happiness, right? It's like that person expressing their power actually enables more power for the system, right? It's like if I'm sharing my happiness with you, I'm not giving you some of my happiness so I have less happiness and you have more happiness. It's actually, we're amplifying. There's something exponential when I share my happiness, right? And when I share my power, in that sense, it's not this limited resource. Now I have less power. We're actually bringing more power to the
Right.
mission.
I love that. That's great. So there's a lot of values, though. Openness, transparency, letting go of control is a huge one. That,
Yes. Yes.
especially people who have had power and privilege, that's really hard. So
Yeah.
there's a whole set of values that I think it's important for networks to really learn about. And that's why I have this little survey that you can have people take to help them see both where they're really good. And I find like lots of more people are open to innovation and new ideas. And that's usually a strength. Other areas like being comfortable with uncertainty and letting go of control, and proactively working on power, and privilege, I think those are ones that people get a little bit more stuck on. But I think you got to have discussions. People need to be modeling these new ways of being for any new decision making to be able to emerge from a network. So that's a starting place. But then let's talk a little bit about the idea of different ways. And I think a lot of the new decision making is about, I mean, there are some camps that are just about, let's use new technologies to give everybody who wants a chance to vote on something. And I find that I think that's going to be interesting. And I think Lumio, for example, is, using some new tools to help people in what's called sort of participative, just making more participative. And let me just share the screen here. And here is
Did you ever read Crowdocracy? Did you ever read that book? It's that idea of, the wisdom of the crowd.
Yes, this idea of the wisdom of the crowd, right? And sometimes it's just decision making, and so there are little button things you can press at conferences, and you can vote on something and immediately see the results. And that's certainly all interesting, and I think there are places where that works. But I think Lumio is trying to create a suite of decision-making tools where you actually poll and prioritizing, sort of dot voting they call. You can make decisions in Slack. These are some of they have a website that helps you see in a little graph if people are ready to make a decision, and room for lots of discussion. So that's one thing that's happening with decision making. Here, I'm going to try to stop sharing. And I think there's a lot of other platforms that have ways to get more people involved in decision making. But I think what we're talking about is going a little bit deeper. Is like, who needs to make decisions about what? How do things happen? How do the operations and decision making happen in networks? And I think that there's a number of new processes, and I think actually most decisions in networks are made through co-design. And nobody really talks about that as a decision making, but when a set of people in a network, let's say they decide there's a web page that they want a web page for their network, and they simply, a group of people who are interested, get together and they co-design a new web page. So lots of stuff in networks happens through just a set of people getting together and creating something, and they make decisions. They're creating.
That's a really important point, June, about in networks. Part of the flexibility of the structure is allowing people's interests to guide where the structure is. And we talk about circles. So when somebody sees something needs to be done and other people are on board with that as a priority, they can form a circle basically and co-design and work on something, but that it's the interest that really guides the structure rather than, I encounter a lot of groups who have a working group on something. They're like, wow, we gotta get out there and recruit for our working group because we're just not, that working group just never seemed to really have lift. And if we could encourage people that, let's just let that working group go, that may not be where, like let the
energy is right now.
Evolve.
Yeah. So just the way that more and more people are using like self-organized collaboratives to do the work of the network. We need to work on the operations and the decision-making of the network as a whole. Everybody doesn't have to be involved in every decision in the same and not in the same way. And so there are some decisions, and I think we're going to talk about that are really important about the the network, and a group
Yeah.
may feel
The
they
overall
want to get
goals.
everybody
Yeah, the common
involved.
agenda.
Yes, if they're
Absolutely.
if
Yeah.
they're more directive about a purpose or whatever. But there's tons of stuff in a network that, as long as you have, see, this has to do with if you really have a good, transparent communication system, you can have a smaller group that are really interested. Okay, we're going to design this web page, and they get together and they come up with a proposal, and then everybody that's going to be affected by it, this is the advice process, then has an opportunity to give feedback or input on that proposal. So you send it out a proposal and say, this is what we want the web page to look like and the features. And then you send that out to the whole network and you say, you have 4 days to get us your feedback back. So then people give feedback back, and then the circle in the advice process, the circle then just takes all that feedback. They try to incorporate as much as they can, but they have the final decision. And that means that things can move very quickly. I mean, networks you need to have decision making be as quick as possible, because networks are very fast moving. And so
that's the essence of distributed leadership. Yeah, that's you want to distribute leadership, distribute authority in a sense throughout and so the people who are most affected are the ones making the decision. The decision doesn't have to go someplace else, but it's the people who are affected
most by it and most interested in it and know most. Get together and do something.
And are going to be implementing it, that are actually going to be doing it.
Right. So, I think that is very freeing, that and that you don't have to, let's say you might have a communications circle in a sense, but its job is not to make these decisions and stuff. Its job is to identify what's a hot button now. Is it the web page? Is it we need a new kind of, we want to work on the whole communications ecosystem. What is it, and who's interested? And their job is to kind of catalyze and say, hey, we're hearing a lot of interest in people wanting to do X. Are you interested? We're going to help set up the first call for a group, a circle that will develop a proposal on this particular thing. And so you're doing things much more, in a sense, piecemeal. But maybe you have that communications group that's trying to kind of fly over the whole network and be that guardian, where it's saying, oh, wow, it seems like there's some real problems here. Let's try to recruit a group to work on that. And so it can be very, very flexible. And the thing that I love about it is that it's very quick. What the saving piece of it is, though, is that if there's a lot of controversy, then you make a very short review. Every decision has a review period. If it's controversial, you say, okay, let's try this out for 3 months or 6 months. And then you'll have a chance to give feedback on how it's worked or make suggestions for how it can change. And then, then we can really make it different then. Just a second. Paul, Aaron's at the door.
So let me share a story with you, because I think that this sense that has come out, it's kind of I call it the consensus baggage, but it's this idea that there has to be unanimity, right, and that everybody is involved in every decision. And that definitely weighs about the idea that not everybody needs to in on every decision, and kind of the way that thinking, like I call it consensus baggage, this idea that everybody is a part of every decision. And so I've been using what I call the autonomy-solidarity spectrum. And so I had a story to share. I was with a group. This was an activist group, and it was very interesting, because the way that, I deliver services, I call our methodology, or it's more than a methodology, but kind of our container for all of this kind of collaboration, I call it Circle Forward. And it's really, I'm seeing it much more like a container right now that we kind of bring into a circle of people. And and enable them to design their processes with in line with these values that you talked about earlier. And so people will design a lot of different processes, and then we suggest processes and things like that when we come in and support people. So I was in a meeting, and it was a group of activists, and it was so interesting because this person, they were having very long meetings, and it was really tiring, and it was, and that was something that they, and so what we noticed was the content of the meetings and what kinds of things they were bringing up for everybody's decision. And one person was wanting to hold an educational event that was right in line with their mission. It was like she wanted to have a movie night. And so I asked the question, well, why is that on the agenda for a decision by the whole group? Why can't she just go hold an educational event? It seems like there's not a lot of controversy there, and that this is bogging down kind of people taking initiative. And they had a group of people who were wanting to take a lot of initiative, which is why they had all of these different proposals coming to their meetings, and their meetings for so long, because they had people who were really active. So it was a really freeing thing for them to just kind of create a policy that said, well, under these conditions, you don't need everybody to decide. Go do these things, go hold these events. And then it became a kind of advice process like you're talking about. Well, come, let us know, stay in communication, talk to people about it. Because of course, if you're going to pull off an event, you need help, and there's, people who want to do it with you. So of course, be talking about it and getting people's input, and that people have resources you didn't know about. But yeah, you don't need their permission. We don't need the whole group's permission. That was a really big step for them. I think you're muted.
Okay, back again.
There you are. There you are. I think, so all of this advice process to me is very much a part of the way I think about the consent process. And because the consent process is a lot about distinguishing just what really it's about the group. It's kind of, first of all, it's to talk about it, I think of ecosystems. And I think that metaphor of ecosystems is really valuable when you're talking about networks, right? And I think more and more people are using that metaphor versus mechanical metaphors. And so within an ecosystem, there's this concept of a range of tolerance. And that's used in biology. So, that has been a really effective tool. Groups pick up on this idea of range of tolerance usually very quickly, and they use it in their networks, and they use it when they go home with their children. And so that's been a really good nugget that has helped, that I think has really helped people with decision making. And so the range of tolerance is saying that there's a wide range. There's a lot of different options that we have here. There's a lot of different things that we could do, and everybody's going to have their own preferences. But as long as nobody has an objection, then go do it. And people confuse, I think, consent, and I've even seen it within the wiki about, on reinventing organizations. Sometimes people still confuse an objection with a block. And so I spend a lot of times really talking about, this isn't a process of blocking, or anybody has a block, which is a consensus term, which feels like it sounds. It's like, I've got a lot of momentum, I'm taking initiative, and you're going to stop me. And so what I talk to people about objections is more, and again, in the systems world, it's more like feedback. So Brian Robertson, who founded Holacracy, has a really good metaphor for the principle of consent, and he thinks of it like riding a bicycle. So you're never just dead on center when you're riding a bike, right? You're always managing yourself from tipping too far to the right or too far to the left, right? So that's your range of tolerance. And so people are sensing, we're all in these different positions in a network. And so we're sensing different things, and we come from different experience, different backgrounds. So we're going to be sensing different things in the environment. And there's so much work that's been done that shows that we have blind spots. Every one of us has blind spots. We have a very narrow range of what we're actually perceiving. So the more that we can, overcome our blind spots by collective processes, the better our decisions are going to be. So really, an objection is not a block. An objection is like on a bicycle. Well, so what do we need to do to adjust so that we can, move forward? And sometimes it's like what you're saying. Sometimes we adjust by saying, well, it's good enough to try. We'll try it, but we're going to try it. We're going to try a prototype. We're going to try something small. We're going to try it for a brief period of time and get some feedback. So those objections is just part of the feedback process. And this is where I think consent and advice getting, this is where they really overlap for me in my mind.
Yeah, but it's sort of like the consent is saying, it's a little bit more emphatic that you need to do something with this feedback. Like in advice, you can take the feedback or not. You try to make sense of it. But a consent process is just saying, hey, you've got to take this into consideration and really do something with it. And that person does then, have a chance to say, okay, this adjustment that you've made as a circle meets my objections. Is that correct?
Well, it's a sort of, but not really, because that feels to me more like consensus. Like, so in actuality, what happens is it's less about, well, you need to meet my concern before we can go forward. It's less about that as much as it's about the experience that you have. And this is where I think advice getting is we aren't good at listening to each other. Like, let's just start with that assumption. Like, over and over, we have blind spots and we move forward with what we think is right. And what I notice and where people break down in a group process, and what you're talking about, is somebody will say, you'll see it in their body. They'll have a bodily experience of an objection, right? Like and what that is saying is like, I have a concern. It's more like I'm sensing something here that is going to create problems for us down the road. And so the response to that is not to try to minimize their objection, which is what is the normal response. And all the time people will say, oh, no, it's not going to be a problem. Let me tell you why. And it's kind of this defensiveness. And so what we work with people, and I work in myself to do, is to actually investigate more. Well, what is this that you're sensing? And the question that I've found has opened up and unlocked this for people is, what's the risk we can't afford to take? Because an objection, it's really like that. It's really saying, I'm sensing a risk. Well, of course I want to hear your risk. Of course I want to hear what you're sensing that I might be missing. And that's the overlap with the advice process is, yes, I really want to investigate. So what's the risk we can't afford to take? And what happens is, as people start to talk about it, what often happens 95% of the time is that the room goes, oh, we never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
Oh, we didn't realize that's what was going on. And so then the room goes, oh, well, this is a different picture. I see. Okay. And then somebody in the room oftentimes will say, well, what if we do this to make an adjustment? And the person who has the objection will often be like, yes, that would cover it. And so what's different from the advice getting process is there's not like a decision maker. So there's not like a person who says, well, I want to do something and I'm going to go around and see, and take everybody's, I'm going to integrate all of their feedback. And then and sometimes it could be that way. Sometimes the person can have a proposal and they check it out with everyone and they adjust it and refine it till everybody's like, yeah, go for it, try it. And that consent process may work like that. But sometimes people come in and it's more like they are just out of consent, or they just see there's this issue and they actually don't know what to do. And it's actually an issue that they can't really solve by themselves or even get to a proposal because they don't have the whole picture and different people have pieces of that information. And so there are times when you have to kind of collectively suss out the way and sense the way forward. And that consent process, if you think about those objections as feedback, if you're like, oh, the feedback, pain pain is coming into the system. Oh, well, let's find the source of the pain. Let's not numb the pain. Let's not just quiet the pain. Let's like listen and hear what is this pain? What is this message that you have for us that we as an organism, as a collective organism, want to integrate? So yeah, there's not this there's the difference, I think, and I think what underlies both advice process, and again, I feel like it overlaps a lot of the way I think of consent, but the grounding on all of this is a sense of dialogue, is a sense of like humility, as Willow says, a sense that none of us has the whole picture, right? And that if we're listening to each other really well, and we kind of set our egos aside and set our need for control aside. I think that you named it.
Yeah.
If we let go of control, and that it doesn't have to be the way I think it should be, but that I'm willing for it, you know, I'm willing to go into this with the knowledge that if I start to sense something that feels like we might be entering some risky territory for our purpose together, that people will listen to me. And some of the feedback that I get from the process, and it's especially people who are quieter, they really like it. But some of the feedback is I don't have to defend myself. Like if I have a concern, I don't have to defend it. And that's really, you know, you've made a shift then from kind of a debate culture to a dialogue culture.
Okay,
so,
but
yeah.
To me, but what you're talking about is really about group decision making. That's what I'm kind of getting
right.
As opposed to a network, which like some of the networks that are out there have thousands of people in them. And, they have organizations that have, lots of people in them, individuals, whatever. And so when you're having more and more networks, don't meet all in one room, and they don't have governing boards. And so in those kinds of situations, I'm just trying to think about what are some of the things that, become increasingly important, and where is the dialogue going to happen. And that's why I think that it's really important that when you start with organizing work in collaboratives, that becomes like the little petri dish, the place where you experiment and begin to learn about dialogue and really good listening and those kinds of things. And that's why I always think it's really important for people to be coached and be in a community of practice when they're doing that. In the same way as when you begin to do your network development and so-called operations in a circle kind of way, where you just are having smaller groups, you really want to work on that dialogue process and co-design. How can co-design be a really listening process? And like really almost no one's writing about that. And that's, to me, is like the foundational piece. And so, when somebody brings up something, how can you not be defensive? How can you listen really well? How can you, search for what it is about what somebody's saying, that find the depths of it that can really improve your proposal and also help that person grow. Because, a lot of this control stuff is just about, neuroses of not growing up in this culture. And
totally.
And so how do you help people, loosen that up? So, that's where in these circles, so much personal transformation happens if you can help that really work right. And so that's one thing. And then it's sort of like, if you send out stuff, if the way you're doing this is everybody's affected on a certain decision, and so you send it out to people, how do you help people learn how to respond? Not just knee jerk, but what helps people slow down and really think what would be helpful about this? Do we need some others? I mean, I think there's, for some things, you need to have multiple, you know, it's not just like when you're doing, say, a whole communication system for a network, you know, you probably need waves of advice giving or what opportunities for people to give that input, you know, into the proposal. And what I've seen is having different kinds of like open forums where people can learn. Like sometimes you can't just send out a proposal. It's a little bit too complex. So you have to have like open Zoom forums where you're explaining about something and getting people in rooms and writing down their thinking. And so you are doing a more building process that's not just with the circle, but is reaching out in several occasions.
That's so true.
Yeah. So
yeah, and all of that, and I do. Yeah. So for me, consent would be building the, I don't know, ground rules isn't really, but kind of our rules for engagement, right? If the principle is consent, which really the history of that, you know, in informed consent, you know, with your doctor, or consent around sexual, you know, activities. And there's a principle of consent of the governed, that any power the government has solely comes from the consent, our consent. And so all of those contexts for consent are about non-coercion. It's about respecting our sovereignty to make choices, right? That it's exactly right. It's like, it's about not being controlled by somebody else, but having that opportunity to choose for ourselves. And so there's something about that, you know, that history of the word and the feeling of that word. And so when we have a network, and we're not gonna, I mean, this is always very interesting to me. And I think it's so relevant because we work with networks that cover a lot of territory in multiple states at a time. There's many, many people. So what you're talking about is like, how do we create rules for engagement that when people are sensing great risks, how can I say, like, hey, how can anybody in the system bring up what needs to be addressed, and have a voice, have a place for what they're sensing. So right now I live out of consent in so many different ways, right? I'm out of consent with what we're doing to the natural environment, right? Like and our system doesn't allow, and there's lots of us that are living out of, and the coral reefs are out of consent right now, right? They're beyond their range of tolerance for the conditions. And if we want coral reefs, we're going to have to listen to and they're not going to talk to us in anything that we understand is like our language. They're going to talk to us in the way coral reefs talk to us, which is this bleaching, which is they're dying, you know, and we are kind of left to, again, to listen and hear what is it that they're needing? What is it that they're sensing, you know, that's not working in this environment? Because we're all so interdependent and interconnected. So when we create these networks, how do we create space for people to sound the alarm? You know, that anybody in the system can sound the alarm, because it protects all of us. Because if you believe that at heart, that we're all basically connected, you know, we're all interdependent, and that what's affecting one of us is affecting all of us. That was like, I love Martin Luther King said that, you know, none of us are free until all of us are free. And I really think that when you start to, you know, think in terms of systems, you see that, because even very small, seemingly small things can actually have great impact, right, in a system. So it's not linear in that way. And so, so how do we set up so that we can hear the coral reef and they can tell us, and we can adjust so that they can survive, because we want coral reefs, because we want intact ecosystems, because we want life on our planet. You know, how can we move and shift so that we can continue to thrive and thrive
Well,
with a level of diversity that
mhm.
creates resilience, you know?
And I'm really curious about some of these groups that are, very diverse. And like I think some of these large landscapes that are dealing with forest
Oh, yeah.
plans and things like that, where you have really
Yeah.
seemingly diametrically opposed the loggers and the tree huggers or whatever, and trying. I think there's a lot that we need to learn about because I think the more we learn and feel comfortable with getting people together with very different perspectives and having that be a
Yeah.
positive experience, I think then that takes some of our fear away and all of our networks can become more
Mhm.
diverse. Right now, a lot of networks are really not that diverse. And I think that again, they're missing out a
Mhm.
lot of voices. And I think the
Yeah.
more comfortable we get with dealing with, um, you know, seemingly diametrically opposed, and learn how to
Yeah.
say, no, that's an illusion that you're diametrically opposed.
Right.
Each of you is like your own network of perspectives. And if we look at it that way, we begin to find places where we can connect. And
Yeah.
I think that's
It's the
why.
both. It's like, how can we have both of these perspectives? It's not either or, but like, how
Yeah,
can we have
right,
both?
right, right.
Yeah.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It's
And then
multi.
people start to get creative when you ask that
Yeah,
question. How can we have
yeah,
both? People start to go, oh, well, because we're great problem solvers. We're
yeah, yeah.
actually, that's
So
our winning strategy
So
as a
I think that
human.
thing about but I think it's like, where is it? It's not always, and this is why, my thing about around the table. It's like you think about people that have really
Mm,
diverse perspectives, but they're working on something that they maybe six of the people of the 1,000 people in the network are getting together and working on something that is less controversial, but important. And
yeah.
they learn in that setting, they learn a lot more about listening, and they build relations. They said, this person is really a good person, even though they have really
Yeah.
perspectives, and all those ways that begin to soften and move us out of that dichotomous kind of place into something more complex. Our
Yeah. That's why
relationships are more complex. They're not either
absolutely.
ors. So,
Yes, exactly. Out of that dichotomous place. I mean, you're really nailing it, and I think it is a petri dish that we're living in right now. And I think that learning to give and receive feedback is one of like the most important lessons right now. And just that humility of realizing that people who think very differently about the world are not wrong and we're right, but that there's a little bit of wisdom, we bring some wisdom, they
mhm.
bring some wisdom, and there's probably more than two perspectives on issues, right? So, yeah, how are we tapping? And that's why I find the range of tolerance, thinking about things in terms of a range of tolerance and being able to say to folks, well,
Mhm.
what's the risk we can't afford to take here? When somebody is, and you'll see it again, it's very embodied. They get more animated, they get more passionate, right? So what is it that's at risk? And I do this with myself because I work with other people. I have a business partner, and sometimes I'll ask myself this. It's like, what's the thing here that I can't really live with? And what can I really live with? What's really kind of negotiable for me, and what's really like bottom line, like not
Mhm.
negotiable for me, or just it's a value, or it's a sense of a level of risk that I can tolerate, or that I think that our business can tolerate together. And so that helps me oftentimes. What's the risk here? Where am I really out of my range of tolerance? And being able to articulate that actually in a willing environment of either my business partner, or if I'm in a circle or with other people, that when they're willing to accept that at face value, right? And say, okay, well, we might not agree, and we might not even understand really this as an issue, but we see that it is. You're sensing something. I'll just accept that I have a blind spot, and we'll find how can we have both. Okay, so how can we take your concern and what you're sensing? How do we go ahead and integrate a better decision? And inevitably, it creates a better decision. Now, we can, by consent, we can structure our engagement to give people a lot of autonomy and self authority to make many, many decisions. And we need to be doing that. I think really we need to be, again, if we're going to let go of something, we're not really letting go of power, we're really letting go of control. If we can decouple power and control.
Yeah,
So we're not letting go of power,
point.
right?
Yeah.
So as we let go of control and we push as much as we can for people to have autonomy and really to have all kinds of decision-making processes going on, while structuring in the opportunity that when we're going too far in a certain, if we're starting to cross and people are starting to sense that we need to, adjust our direction collectively in some way, that they have a way to be out of consent. They have a way to stand up and in whatever way that is, right, to be able to, and to not, and this is one of the other practices and consensus that drives me crazy, is if you have that objection, you don't have to be the person that comes up with the answer to your objection. So a lot of times people say, well, if you want to block this, you've got to have an alternate proposal. And I find that will just kind of shut people down, really. So if you can say, just get really clear what it is, oftentimes, more often, I said 95% of the time, the rest of the room, as people start to articulate what it is they're sensing, the rest of the room goes, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. We don't want to do that. You're right. Let's build in, let's do this. And they start to propose things. And the proposal process is also another one of those gems, putting things into proposals that you put out and get feedback on is a great, right? That's a great tool. But once we've gotten our mission, once we've gotten some of our big purpose kind of, that collective, there's certain things, again, we need solidarity around. Once we've gotten solidarity on things, there's plenty that, again, can be, it goes in traditional thinking, it goes from sort of a governance decision to more of an operations decision. And there's been that traditional kind of differentiation between governance and operations. So once we know what our overall goal is and what our budget is, then, we can give a lot of autonomy for people to manifest, in whatever ways make sense, what our collective ideas, and for people to, so in that way, I think the advice process is one of those, like range of tolerance. I think advice process is one of those concepts that people can quickly assimilate and get. Like, they get what that means. We've done that. We go around, we have a problem, we go around, we get different points of view on it, and it starts to fill out a bigger picture for us, and then we can take action from a more informed place. So I think it's a really useful way for people to think about what we've been talking about, is being able to self-organize, really being able to self-manage and self-organize, and not all be in the same room, and not control, right? Not try to control the outcome. Yeah.
Okay, well, great. I think this was really lots of fun and very informative, and I certainly learned some new things.
Me too.
Those of you watching, if you have any experiences with governance and decision-making in networks, please let us know, and we will share that knowledge with you, or set up another call where we can discuss what you're doing. So thanks so much, and good governing.
Thanks, June.
Take care.